Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, kicking off our series on data analysis and impact reporting. I'm going to go ahead and do some quick introductions here in a second, but we're very excited to talk to you today about how we approach impact work and analysis at Undaunted Consulting. So first and foremost, my name is Michael Baker. I am a consultant here with Undaunted Consulting. Been working here for about a year and a half. I'm very excited to work with a number of different nonprofits. And my background is in education. I have worked with education nonprofits on policy work for a few years now, but also been in the education space for the past 10 years. And support nonprofits with a number of different things, from everything including Salesforce work to impact reporting and other data analysis. I'm joined by my colleague, the wonderful Quinita Whitfield, who I'll let her introduce herself real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to talk about.
Hi, everybody. Quinita. I'm a data consultant here at Undaunted. I've just gotten over my first year with them, and I specialize in data analytics, especially Power BI reporting. So I'm very familiar with a variety of industries in that. So if you need any help in that area, I'm your person.
Great. Thank you, Quinita. So our agenda for today and for this webinar is to talk a little bit more about data analysis and analytics. Why is it so important for nonprofits? Why do you need to be thinking about it? How does it tie into your day-to-day? A lot of nonprofits oftentimes end up having to do some type of data analysis when it comes to the end of year report. But taking it a little bit of a step further, we'll break down a case study and an example from our hypothetical Pawnee Community Center for those of you who are fans of Parks and Rec, and then a couple of key takeaways at the very end. There's going to be some time for questions at the very end of our meeting. So if you do have questions, feel free to hold on to them for a second. We'll open up the chat for everybody and make sure people can jump in and type those in. Again, very excited for everybody that's joining in today, and I'll go ahead and jump right into it. So first and foremost, I think for a lot of people that find themselves in the nonprofit space, you have to do an end of year report. You have to identify your key performance indicators and your KPIs because you're filling out a grant application. There's been an RFP that's been put out. And then when it's time to actually find them, everyone kind of swings around in circles figuring out, what did we actually do in the past year? It's a lot to talk about. It's a lot to digest because you're so busy in the weeds of actually doing the amazing work that nonprofits do. Right? So what we want to try to do is make that job easier for you all. And there's a couple of different processes and frameworks that we'll talk about to make it really easy to understand and make it so that your RFP goes through smoothly and then you're able to quickly identify what you need. When we think of evaluation at Undaunted, we always understand and start from a basic evaluation plan and framework. It's easy to be reactive. Hey, there's an RFP out. Let's throw everything we have together very quickly in this grant application and throw it forward. But it's hard to be proactive. Having a plan and set forth of what we want to actually evaluate can make things super easy and streamlined for the future whenever you are getting around to doing that annual report or that grant application. So we break it down in 3 easy steps, right? First, it's important in your evaluation plan, just like you have a plan for any of the programs that you offer, to actually set aside time to plan. What are we trying to evaluate? Go back to your mission statement, going back to your visions that you set out, your goals, right? What do we need to make sure that we have in place in order to evaluate the work that we do? But also an important part of the process of anything that you do is evaluating what you have ongoing and reflecting and using that to continue to inform your work, of actually taking the time to evaluate your work and celebrating those accomplishments and sharing out, which can be important for any time you're trying to raise funding or, again, apply for those grants that you all are actively seeking. I would love to hear from Quinita what you have done when you have approached some of the organizations that you've worked with. Particularly, I know that you had mentioned that you work with this neighborhood association, which is why we're all here, right? And learn a little bit more from this case study of how Quinita, through the work we've done at Undaunted, supported this association and actually putting together an evaluation plan. But before we get into that case study and what you specifically did, I'd love it if you can share a little bit of background about this neighborhood association that you've been working with and how you got involved with them. What did you do? Right? Tell us a little bit more.
So the neighborhood association I was working with came from a voluntary organization website, right, where they look out for consultants. And so they found me on there and they saw my data expertise and they knew that they needed help with reporting their impact on their community. And so at first, we weren't sure if we were going after the community center, but after a time they decided, you know what, the community center is a hub of what we're doing. They do a lot of events there. And so they wanted to use that to show their impact and so that they can help make improvements at that community center.
You said it's a hub. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was a hub for in that neighborhood? Any of the specific programs or things that they were doing that kind of drives who they were, right, and what they offered?
Right. So this community center was in Philadelphia, and so they have a really well-known basketball program. They got a sponsored basketball court put in, and that was attracting a lot of the community, right? So they had people of different age groups coming in to participate with that, and that was attracting them to events for their programs and events, such as their playground, and then they had also classes like their crochet classes. They did pickup games, and they had after-school programs, summer camps, even gaming places for kids to participate in after school.
Great. Well, it sounds like they did a lot. So that can be a lot to kind of figure out. And why were they sort of getting involved with you in the first place? What were they trying to achieve in approaching you?
Yeah, so their main goal was they wanted to prove their impact because they wanted to see the success of that basketball court program transition also into their field sports. But the field itself had not had any updates. And so they were going to use the impact that's being shown from those programmings to fund and fundraise for updates to the field.
Right. Great. I mean, that sounds great, right? But trying to find impact of folks that are using a basketball court sounds difficult, right? How do you analyze people that are coming to a basketball court? So that seems like a challenge. And let's talk about that a little bit more. So you provided some of this context already, right? Which is that the organization supported a lot of different local programs, right? They want to rehabilitate their fields, which needed some repair. But again, there's some difficulty, right, showcasing the impact of their programs, right? How do you start when it comes to people coming to utilize a basketball court? Talk me through some of the challenges that you kind of had in your approach. So it sounds like we already addressed some of them, which is kind of connecting the purpose of their organization and then measuring the significance of it. But can you tell me a little bit more about your challenges that you immediately saw in approaching them in their work?
Mm-hmm. So when it came to basically building out the reporting, we weren't really sure what was going to be relevant to showing their impact. And so we decided to look at their organization kind of as a whole. So we took the whole community center and we looked at what were all of the programs. We weren't focused on just the basketball program or just the field program. We're focused on figuring out the impact of all the programs in the community. I think when I was originally approached, they were kind of saying, oh, we support the kids, right? We support the teens. The basketball program attracts the youth. I was like, that's great, but is anybody else using community center? So we found out there was a senior community that was using community center. There were parents that were using community center, and they were coming at various hours of the day. And we were able to show that participation also shows their impact. And so we went ahead and we got together and we saw like all of the events that they were putting on, all of the camps that they were putting on, all of the recreational activities that they were putting on. And then we started from there and kind of went into the details to figure out what to report on exactly. And that's kind of where that measure in the next section kind of starts.
Yeah. So how did you measure that? It sounds like you decided to spread the net a little bit wider, right? Mm-hmm. To get a better idea of what was the full scope of the programs outside of just basketball. But tell me a little bit more about how you really analyzed the more holistic work that they were doing. Did you engage the community at all or anything like that?
Right. And so in order to get those kind of numbers outside of what was, shown in registrations, we also decided to do a survey. And so through the survey, we're able to see the exact numbers of people who are participating, what their thoughts were on the programs, and then what they got out of each of these programs.
Great. So survey, right, you're getting those kind of qualitative responses of, hey, this is what people actually think, here's how they respond. And then that also gives you that kind of local community perspective on the work that they're doing, which becomes a data point that you can use, which is great. So to recap, this neighborhood association had this basketball program that was very successful, but they needed to do something about their fields. You said, hey, what else are you doing? This seems like y'all have something that's really impactful. And can we get those both anecdotal pieces from the neighborhood, but also quantify it through a survey that we can use to showcase how important the work that y'all are doing is?
Exactly.
The solution is you conducted that survey, right? Who came to the rec center? What were they doing at the center? So real quick, everybody, one thing I want to talk very quickly about is how we approach that evaluation model. Why did we zoom out the way that we did? You might have heard of Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. We apply the same level of work to the work that we do in Adopted because we think it's a very valuable framework to think about evaluation as well, right? So starting from that kind of central core message, which is why do you do what you do? The neighborhood association, they wanted to make an impact in the neighborhood. How they were accomplishing that was they were focusing on the basketball side of things, but they were accomplishing that in many other ways as well. But really the how gets to what are the programs, what are the specific components that help you accomplish that overall goal and mission? And then the what is the nitty gritty details. What are the specifics that come into play? So what are those programs accomplishing? Are those outcome metrics? We'll talk about those as well, but also the components of who are the volunteers, who's currently keeping the grounds, who's actually maintaining things, who's running these camps and programs, those actual specific pieces that become part of your overall story. Well, I'm sure you all are already familiar with SMART goals, right? The SMART method to think about goals. But I think a lot of people forget about what the actual acronym stands for and the specific components. They wanted to make an impact on their community, but then they forget about the measurable parts and maybe that it's time-based and that the goal is attainable, right? So how do we measure those specific pieces of, hey, I want to help the kids in our community? Right. So digesting that can be a little bit more difficult, but it's super helpful when we start going from that why to how to what aspect of the Golden Circle. So I want to do exactly that. Queen, I'd love to kind of using that exact same framework. Let's walk through how you got from point A to point B of, hey, we want to work in our neighborhood and support the kids in our community to let's conduct a survey. So starting from the top, right, we have that why statement. What is their goal, mission, objective? You've already talked about this already, but I'd love to hear in a little bit more detail how you help them resolve their why question.
So basically, they just wanted to show the impact that the community center was having on the community in order to use that information to fundraise for supporting those fields, right? And so by being able to show the impact the community center is having, they're more likely to be able to show the impact on their community.
Right. So you mentioned that understanding the why helped them to figure out the scope that they had, or really the scope of work and what the impact was on their community. But it seems like their why is their community, right? Community-based work was the important part. And so that ends up being the core component of that evaluation, right? We need a community-based evaluation solution to really understand, is our why being effective? Let's go a level further, which is the how. How were they helping their community, right? How were they actually working with their community to uplift them, right? Create impact, whatever the case may be that was connected to that why statement.
And so that was what the events that they were putting on were for, the school programs were for, any kind of outreach that they had coming out of that community center. That was basically the how for this one.
Right. So you mentioned that they were reaching their goal of having an impact on the community through a couple of different avenues, right? You mentioned community programs at the community center. That's, I guess, thing one. The use of the facilities themselves, which could be considered another component. You also mentioned outreach. Can you tell me a little bit more about any outreach they might have done?
Mm-hmm. Basically, they would have, like medical fairs. They would have other community type events. And then when it came to like voting, they would put in voting programs, any of those sorts of things to support that community and give them kind of a hub where they could go to for information about what's going on in their neighborhood.
I like that idea that you mentioned of a hub, right, as a central place for them to do the work that they're doing, which again, is the whole kind of definition of what we think about with community. But there's a ton of different programs that you have here, all of which I think do serve as a mechanism for uplifting community by creating a central space, but also saying, hey, here's a place to vote. Hey, here's a place to learn a little bit more information about what's going on in the neighborhood. Let's talk a little bit more about the what, right? What were they doing that answers that why question and brings it back to the top? You mentioned all these how specific programs, but what were the pieces and components involved that, again, led you to the survey, but also were a part of solving their overall problem? So give me a little bit of the show and tell, if you will.
Mhm. So, there were art programs, there were sports programs, there were health programs, and all of these kind of supported that there was impact the community because community is one who participated in these programs. And then we were able to use that survey to get out, what was the measurable outcome from that? Were you not involved with art before, now you are? Were you growing your skill set in something? Were you given access to something you might not have had before? All of those things are really important, especially considering the type of neighborhood that they were in.
Oh, so you mentioned a couple things there I thought were really cool. So one of the things that you mentioned was growing a skill set through the programs, and then you mentioned something else about participation. But there's also some other, I guess, more anecdotal components as well. Of do they feel better with the community? Could you tell me a little bit more again about what were those like specific questions that you were asking with respect to these specific programs?
Sure. So a little bit would be like what was your outcome? Like what did you learn from the program? What did you get out of the program? Did you feel closer to your community? We had some questions around how did they feel about the courses? How could they be improved? What other things would they like to see? Do they need more hours? Would they like more frequency, more opportunities to be involved? All of those sorts of things were in that survey with the goal of being able to really get a clear picture of who is participating, what they're getting out of it. Did they return,
Yeah, so like return rates, that's another great one. Almost kind of like a net promoter score, right? I think is, are they going to recommend that to somebody else? Is that something that they would be interested in? Which is another quantitative metric that you can use to reflect back on the work that's been going on. One of the things that you just mentioned is outcomes-based work, which is kind of like a type of metric. So let's pause for a second, and I'd love to just talk with everybody else real quick about metrics. Things about metrics is there's a lot of different ways to define different metrics. And Quinita has mentioned a couple already, right? Where we said we had a survey component, but that survey component is meant to address, are you going to come back? Or did you learn something from the course? These can be categorized in a couple of different ways. And I think it's all really important to reflect back on answering those why, how, what questions as part of our framework to inform our work. So we also mentioned KPIs. And again, I think KPIs are those key performance indicators that link two separate, very important components, goals and, of course, performance. One of the things that we always think about is we want to kind of filter down so we don't have so much noise, which is based off our goals, is this metric key to who we are, where we've been, what we're trying to evaluate? If the answer is no, it's not a KPI. If it is, it is. And that's what we want to include. So something, for example, like, hey, I want to know how people voted when they came and voted at our voting booth at the community center, probably not relevant, right? It's probably not something that's involved with the work that we're doing. Now, something like, hey, these are the number of people that attended our class. Well, growing the scope and size of our classes at the community center is important to our work. We do think that that's something that's evaluated. So yeah, that probably is a KPI. We do need to probably make a measure of attendance so that way we can consider the size and scope of the work that we're doing. All of those things, if you want to think about it, make sure you're bridging those two gaps together to inform the work that you're doing. Now, again, going into metrics, this is probably going to look like a lot, but it's a great way to break down that hierarchy and begin to organize the work that you do. You sort of have the two overarching umbrellas, which are process metrics and results metrics, and then within those, a few other categories. So on the left-hand side here, the process metrics, the things that I think about are These are metrics meant to assess the work as you're working on it. So this includes the input and outputs that are going through the processes, or if you are a program-based organization, the programs that you are running. So an input would be like, hey, I'm running this class and this is my budget for the class. These are the number of staff volunteer hours. I am putting in resources and I need to make sure that I'm evaluating what I'm putting in those resources. And the output would be, what did you do with those resources as part of the program? Well, part of the output is we had, X number of classes. We had Y number of people that worked over these hours, or we ran it over, a certain number of weeks. That gives you an idea of the scope of the activities that come out of the work that you are putting in. On the flip side, on the right-hand side, we have our results metrics, which is where we get to what happened after you did all the things. Most of the time, this is what people gravitate towards when you're thinking of a grant application or an RFP. You're thinking of, I need to be looking at outcomes, but it's important not to forget the process, the road that you got to on the way there. That goes back to our plan, act, evaluate cycle. When we think of the results metrics, oftentimes this is where some of those harder metrics, the quantitative metrics come into place, which is, or the immediate changes and the outcomes that you had in the community. After people finished a class, did they increase in their proficiency in a certain skill? After people participated in a basketball camp, were they better at basketball, or did they feel good about their basketball skills, or did they simply just enjoy their time there? What were the immediate changes that took place? The impact metrics are those kind of like big, hairy, audacious goals that happen over a longer period of time, thinking back to your SMART goals, your overall vision and mission for your organization. So after running this program for a certain number of years, how did that program grow or become a part or an integral part of defining that community? Do people reflect positively on the community center as a whole because of this program? Those are where you zoom out a little bit, right? And reflect back to your mission and your why statement, which is another important part of the long-term effects of what you do. Now, Queen, I'm about to tag you back in here because I think that I did enough talking about the theoretical and the high level stuff. And I'd love to hear how you broke down this framework for the organization that you work with. So let's talk a little bit more on the left-hand side first. Let's talk through the process and then we'll get to the results.
Mm-hmm. So we spoke a little bit about having kind of that big wide net, right? And so now this is kind of us breaking that apart into its pieces. And so, for example, at the community center, they have some crochet classes that they have a good amount of participation in. And so when we're trying to break that down, we get into what are those components of it? Like who's involved? What's the budget related to it? How many people, how many volunteers, right? And so this is kind of that breakdown there. So for a crochet class, our input would be the budget and the volunteers help keep it going and any staff help keep it going, right? And the output is we have those classes and then we have their attendees that we're able to measure. On the input side, right, the costs associated are the hours spent and the dollars spent having that program. So any kind of supplies, paying those people, all of those things. And then who are the volunteers and how many participated, to help keep this program going. And then how often are these classes occurring, which for in their case, it's a couple times a week. And then the output of the classes and the attendees is the amount of classes that we had, which is a few a week, and the attendees over that period of time.
So that was one great idea, right? So thinking back of, okay, a process starting with a program, you mentioned the crochet class, and then breaking it down into its components, starting with the input side of the resources that you put in, and then the output side of, okay, what came out of that program? You ran these classes, the attendees came over a certain time period based off of the work that you put in, right? Scheduling, volunteering, dollars, collateral, all that type of stuff. How did you assess those? Was that something that you quantified or you worked with the organization to get that data?
I mean, it was a little bit of work with the organization, but some of these classes, the ones that are registered for, we had some of those numbers already. And so we were able to get most of that from their system that they already had, like staff scheduling, volunteer scheduling. We got an idea of who was there, how many were there, what does it take to support that program. And then for the person who's leading the class, that's where we got more of those budget numbers, the cost of supply numbers, and how much it really costs to put it on over a period of 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, so that's asking a lot of questions. And I think in an ideal world, right, most organizations track these things already based off of just running the work that you do. But it does require you to have some thought and input process to make sure that you are capturing those effectively. So going back to that plan, act, evaluate cycle that we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, right, understanding, hey, we planned this program out, but when we're evaluating, we can reflect on those individual pieces and talk to the right program coordinator, talk to the right manager here to make sure that I'm understanding each of those components. Awesome. Let's zoom out a little bit. So now we talked a little bit about process. Let's talk now a little bit more about those results metrics.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of my favorite part because this is where the survey, means a lot more, because now we can kind of get to the exact feedback from the people who are doing it firsthand. And so again, with the case of the first GA class, one of the outcomes we what did they learn, right? And we're able to take that information and say, okay, well, Cheryl participated in the class. She had never tested crochet hook before. Now she can make a granny square. And now we know that she's upskilled herself basically in that, right? And if you know anything about crochet, it translates to other skills as well, such as math and coding. So it's really important. And so the outcomes, when we say what did they learn, we're able to show, the course completion and the knowledge shown, the impact over time might be able to use those skills to start a business or grow into other skills, get into more fiber arts or get into art in general. And that relates back to the mission, because when they're going through those classes, they're building relationships with people who are in the classes who they're upskilling with. I think most of us know from sports and other programming, the more that you can be around a person with a similar goal to you or similar skill to you, similar hobby to you, like the better, the stronger those relationships are, right? And you feel more part of that community, you feel more part of that, our hub, which is the community center in this case.
Yeah. And so what were the kind of questions that you asked as part of the survey to help address that? Could you provide a couple of examples? I think course completion, right, we can probably say okay, they completed that course. That's quantifiable. You can measure the attendees. If they weren't measuring the attendees, you might be able to poll the community. But the knowledge shown question, I'm interested to hear how you approach that question with the survey.
I mean, we kept it kind of general, right? It could be things as simple as, what did you learn from this class, or what did you get out of this class, and leaving that box kind of open-ended, and then running an analysis on it to find kind of trends in that with other people who have given feedback. And I think the best way of doing open-ended is because then you can kind of get the truest recording of what they got out of that class versus us having multiple choice questions, which we did, which were did you learn certain skills? You know how to use a hook, and you create a blanket, it's particular stitches. We would have done those kinds of things as well. But I think keeping it open-ended was really impactful.
Which I think is also a very interesting choice, because you sort of think of it in two different ways from the data analysis side of things. For those of y'all who are analysts on the live that are interested in that information, right? You can think of qualitative coding and thinking of specific keyword selection, which, we can talk a little bit more about later on. But you can also think of the quantifiable side of things, which is using a Likert scale of you strongly agree, disagree, all that kind of stuff. I think that's very interesting, is by using an open-ended, you can gather more fundamental responses that folks may or may not have felt comfortable with if they're just doing a survey. They could be a little bit more candid. Could you tell me a little bit more about how many folks responded to the survey? How did you kind of get them involved? Because I feel that's one of the things with surveys is you never really know what you're going to get.
Yeah, I know we got over 100 results back, which is much more than the previous survey they had. I believe the year before was only about 30 people. And so we were able to triple that. I think in the future we would like more, because we know that participants in that community center is much higher. And so that's why we were doing a little bit of brainstorming around connecting the surveys to more events and trying to make it as accessible as possible. So previously, most of those surveys were sent electronically, but for future, they're going to basically tag it on to the end of other events where the community comes out more, right? So that if there's anyone who doesn't have access to a computer or anything like that, they'll just have a volunteer to take that information down and give them the paper version. But that's something we're working on for the future.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think the obvious question, because I think at Undaunted, we're obviously super passionate about making sure that our work reflects back on the organization, the community itself, which is how did they feel about the results, right? How did this inform their ongoing work in that plan, act, evaluate cycle?
Yeah, I know they love the process. I think they're still using it. We're trying to get feedback on the side of funding. And we're not quite there yet. But I know they really appreciated the survey. They thought the questions were very thorough. They were to get more usable information to really drive forward off of. And I mean, it just kind of fits their goal that they have of updating that field. And we're going to see where that takes us soon.
Yeah, I think that's great. Putting it all together, right? You had this goal, which was we wanted to increase our community engagement, and you kind of helped them to redefine it a little bit more by focusing on classes and programs that they were specifically involved in across ages and ability levels. We talked a little bit more about process and results metrics that you helped us break down of how do you measure the things as they occur, which is attendance and input hours and volunteers, and the results afterwards of utilizing the survey to gather feedback on the class itself and then other programs that they were involved in at the community center. And you helped define a couple of KPIs for us over here. I'm wondering if you could actually talk us through these kind of like selected KPIs very quickly at a high level and tell us how this kind of ended up being part of your final solution and resolution for the evaluation.
Yeah. So I think some of these are probably you can understand the impact of anything frequency related, right? So total participants over the last year, over time in their programs, it's just important to show growth over time. Who are you engaging? What percentage of your neighborhood are you engaging? Like I said, it's a hub of a neighborhood. We want to know what the percentage is of people participating from within that area. And some of that was also focusing a bit on, are we attracting just our neighborhood? Or are we also pulling in a couple of neighboring neighborhoods? We want to make sure we're clear on that. And then we have our participant retention rate. We're really interested, not only are they, if they came in for like, say, the basketball program, where it's flashy and new, did that bring them into other programs and events as well? That's something that we wanted to know. And we have the Net Promoter Score. So how likely are they to recommend it to a friend or a neighbor, kind of expanding that even further to the community by word of mouth. And then we have volunteer involvement. How many volunteers are required to keep these programs going? What are their basically demographic information? And then we have the skill progression. This is kind of that open question is related to, did you increase the skill? How's that helping you in your daily life, or how's that helping you in your work? And then completion rate, we want to know how many people started and how many people ended in certain programs, right? And then cross-program participation is really what I said before, where if you've gone into our basketball program, did you also go into the field sports programs? Did you also come to our after-school programs? You use the gaming room, all of those things.
So really just kind of expanding this same framework to the other programs that you offered. And that's how you kind of like flesh things out for the community organization as a whole.
Right. And I think for any key performance indicators, they're kind of like the pulse of everything that's going on. It gives you a really clear picture of where you're at, where you're going, where you can improve. And so by clearly defining those things, it helps you map out like your future goals for the following year.
Awesome. All right. Well, y'all, I think that is going to put us in for Q&A. I would love to hear from you all any questions that you have for me or for Quinita.
We have one from David over there already.
Okay, great. Yeah, feel free to chime in as we go through. I'll read David's question. It says, what strategies did you use that got such an increase in response rates over previous years?
Mm-hmm. So I know in the previous survey, which I wasn't involved with, it was very high level. Like there wasn't any in-depth questions. No, it was very specific. And they only distributed those surveys for a very short amount of time. I think they gave themselves a couple weeks to put that survey together. And at the start of my interaction with them and getting an idea of what their goals were, I kind of felt like that wasn't enough time. I know a lot of these things are sent out via email, and everybody checks their emails every day. And I also acknowledge the fact that maybe not everybody in the community has access to email at all times. And so that kind of changed how we approached it for this year. And so what we ended up doing was giving them a few months to distribute the survey. And then we also sandwiched it in between events that they were having in the community so that they could, verbally tell people like, hey, you should be expecting a survey. This is how you're going to be able to get it. These are the ways that you can complete it. This is why we're doing it, and so you're able to get them more invested by telling them that it's coming, to expect it, than it was for them to just send it out and only give a short period of time to collect that information.
Great. So connecting that to specific events, so that way you're getting people kind of right where they are and meeting where they're at.
Right.
Okay, another question from Maddie. What tools should a small nonprofit use to track and analyze data? This is a great question. I get this a lot. Is sort of like, where do I start? What do I actually use? I think a lot of people find just frankly just using like Excel or Google Sheets as super accessible, and then connecting that to something like a Google Form or other tools that are kind of freemium. I know that you probably use some specific ones like SurveyMonkey or something like that for your survey tools. But Queenie, I'd love to know if you use something specific for this type of work.
Mm-hmm. So in this specific case, with Community Center, we did use SurveyMonkey, but we also had some, paper input that we did as well. And then when it came to tracking, analyzing the data, we used worksheet software, Google Sheets, Excel. I would say that if you have access to more robust reporting software, that can make it easier in the future. I'm obviously a Power BI trainer, so I'm a little bit biased on that, but it does help for when you want to add future years or expand that data, right? Instead of having to redo it every single time, you just add that data in and it expands it, and you can keep looking at your year over year changes and growth. And it only takes a few minutes versus a few hours.
Awesome. And professionally, I have used, on the other side of the Power BI side of things, I've used Tableau. Another thing, if you're looking for more, I would say, hardcore statistical software, we can talk and have another conversation about that as well. But R is open source and freely accessible. There's a lot of great open source solutions for more advanced analysis. But 9 times out of 10, you can probably get what you need from just using Google Sheets. We are always of the opinion, simplify rather than creating it too robust or overcomplicating your tool suite, especially given the size and scope of your organization. Great. If your data is messy or incomplete, how do you clean it up? Oh man, so many different. That's every analyst's favorite question, because that's what they do for 90% of their day. For me, knowledge is the most important thing when it comes to cleaning a messy or incomplete data set. If you come across from intellectual curiosity, hey, we're missing fields or we're missing information, or why didn't this person answer this question? I thought I marked it as required on the survey, right? Understanding why is super important. Maybe somebody doesn't feel comfortable providing race, ethnicity, or gender questions. That is super okay. We need to understand that as humans to make sure that we can approach and meet people where they are. But other questions, right, that maybe are left blank, could be a process that we need to reflect on from a survey design side of things, or it could be something where we just need to actually look and make sure we coded something correctly. But Queenie, I'd love to hear your opinion as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of I think I thought a little differently than you did, where I was kind of thinking, well, if you have the main SI or data analyst that help you clean up that data, that's probably the best they can do. And they can help you figure out how you're getting that data, how you're processing it is optimal, and less work in the long run. But if you're the person doing it, it's kind of just addressing gaps and comparing it to the systems that you have in place and making sure that the technology is matching up to what's happening in real life.
Yeah. So you're saying you clean up your data by planning ahead, so you have to clean it up less. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But also just having as much forethought. Sometimes you're going to inherit that data. Everyone does. And that's okay. But it's the best way that we can think about to reinform the data that we're actually working with. Is like, hey, let's plan ahead, make sure we're really understanding what exactly we're trying to measure. People always say good data in, good data out, bad data in, bad data out, right? So if you have bad data that you're collecting that you don't feel like you're assessing or answering the research question that you need properly, then maybe it's time to reevaluate the questions. Just a huge part of that plan, act, evaluate cycle. All right. Other questions? We have a few more minutes here. Great question. Yeah. So when collecting data, and is it easier to manage a pick list rather than a write-in option? But you feel like write-in option is more person-centered. What is the best way to manage write-in data on the back end of data collection? So there's a couple of different tools that I'm aware of. From the quantifiable side of things, obviously that's the easy part when it comes to, hey, someone said strongly agree or disagree. Another thing, a lot of people on the qualitative research side of things, people like to use coding for specific words. So oftentimes you can do something, and a data analyst would be familiar with this, of building like a word cloud of what are the most common themes that you see from a general word search or word input that generate ideas for you all to use. So if we say, hey, people thought something was, in 8 out of 10 responses, people really liked the basketball program. That was the thing that I thought was most important for the community. You could see that in a generated word cloud that shows up. And it's a very visual way to showcase the work that you're doing. Or you can code specific words and use that for, hey, this word or these instances appeared X amount of times in our data set. And that becomes your way of showcasing qualitative data. That's a common qualitative research approach, but Queen, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think about when you're getting those open responses?
Yeah, so I don't think at the time that I was doing this survey it came up as much, but more later on with other projects, I started using more sentiment analysis, which kind of goes into the word cloud and everything as well. But because we're in a time where we have access to AI and it's free in a lot of cases, we're able to run really thorough sentiment analysis on information like this. If you're getting those write-in options, and you're getting a bulk of them, we can use that sentiment analysis even in your worksheet software to really develop a write-up of what these people are saying and the frequency and what you should focus on. And so just by leveraging a little bit of AI for that sentiment analysis. If you're not familiar with sentiment analysis, it's kind of that evaluation of the words and the patterns in that.
Yeah, and to tie back to Maddie's question, and actually, I guess it kind of relates to David's questions as well, which is in terms of specific tools, there's a great resource out there that I usually recommend for nonprofits. It's called Tagit. It's an open source tool that is very helpful for like highlighting specific words that you can tag, kind of like with like a tag in a website, for connecting different keywords in text. So as you're reading through those responses, I can tag specific words and say, okay, that means that this is a positive reaction or a negative reaction or something like that. It's very easy to set up. It's very light. It runs on pretty much any type of computer you have, Mac, Windows, whatever. And so that's a tool that I would highly recommend. But Dave, to kind of your example, right, looking for inflection and tone and specific types of verbiage that you're looking for, where they react positively or negatively. It's their strong verbiage, like very or not, that is a part of their reaction, because it's an important part of measuring where people are in terms of both their biases, but also their actual thought on a specific program. But Quinita, please take it away. I don't want to talk too much on the theoretical side.
Well, I mean, I just do it's kind of simple. So I like I said earlier, you can do it in your worksheet software. I recently did one for J3 Academy on their survey where I'm using an if S and a regex match to copy certain words that have a positive affiliation and then words that have a negative affiliation, and then I'm giving them a score. So I'm using that score to inform, if we're on the positive upswing or the negative for those questions.
All right, y'all. Thank you for joining. There will be a recording available for everybody. And of course, if you are interested in learning more and want to connect with us personally, you can check out our site at advanted.llc. And also, there's a contact form that you can fill out just to let us know about your nonprofit, who you are, where you're coming from. And we would love to work with you all. So again, thank you all for dialing in. Have a great rest of your week, day, weekend, all of those things. And hopefully we'll talk to y'all again soon.